Hello, my name is Simon. Welcome to Why Is That, a free speech platform where we explore big ideas and the controversies of our time. Hello, beloveds, and welcome back to another episode of Why Is That? Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Janice Fiamengo from the University of Ottawa, who will be talking with us about cultural Marxism and feminism and its influence in academia. Hello, Dr. Fiamengo.
Hello there, Simon. How are you?
Good. So what got you interested in this topic? What got you into?
Well, I guess it would be that when I got my first full-time job, which was at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, I was really excited to be a teacher of English, and I had this idea that the university was a place where people would have intense arguments about literary subjects, and we would debate various interpretations of important works of literature, and that it would be a intellectually really vibrant place, and that we would encourage that passion for truth and for open debate in our students. And, I was just so excited to be part of the academy. And when I actually started my first full-time job, I was shocked to discover that it didn't actually seem like most of my colleagues were that interested in debating interpretations of literature, that in fact they were much more interested in discussing social justice, and that on that subject there was really no room for debate at all, that there was an orthodoxy that everyone was expected to adhere to, that we were supposed to communicate that orthodoxy pretty clearly to our students, and I was really disappointed because it hadn't been what I expected at all. And it was a shocking experience, actually, to see the uniformity of thought and the fear of stepping out of line amongst my colleagues in department meetings, in all sorts of public forums. People were afraid to say what they really believed about a whole variety of issues, such as the relations between men and women, the position of Aboriginal people in Saskatchewan culture, race relations, multiculturalism, all those very important topics in our society. There wasn't debate about those at all. There was just a deep uniformity, and so I started thinking about why that was and how it had happened. I started reading up on how it had happened that the university, which was once a place where truth was pursued, had become a place where it seemed that social justice ideology was much more important than truth.
Yes, I've noticed, like places like New Zealand and Canada, etc., free and open societies, but in a lot of these institutions, a lot goes on behind closed doors that people would really be shocked about. There are like professional codes of ethics, etc. But it literally sort of a bullying culture can arise and form a culture of fear where people can't really speak out what they're thinking, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, that's very much the case. Many people are afraid to speak out, even though academics are some of the most protected people in terms of our job security. We're some of the most protected people in the world, but peer pressure and various other kinds of professional pressures do prevent many people from speaking. Even if we can't actually lose our jobs for saying the wrong thing, we can certainly be publicly disgraced. And of course, there are all sorts of professional professional harms that people can experience. You can find yourself on the outs with your colleagues and prevented from publishing in in the prestigious journals and prevented from being invited to conferences or to do collaborative work and research with colleagues and that sort of thing. So there are all sorts of ways in which people are kept in line. And I was really shocked to see. I participated in all sorts of hiring decisions at the University of Saskatchewan. We were hiring quite a bit when I was first hired there in 1999, and we were hiring based on identity categories rather than based on merit. That was really the first thing that most deeply repulsed me about social justice ideology, that we were bound and determined not to hire any white men if we could possibly avoid it, because we wanted to show our commitment to various kinds of equity. And anyone who objected to that, or even to raise it, as a potential problem, was shushed and was told that we didn't understand really the importance of what was going on, or even there was an outright denial that what we were doing was actually ignoring merit and hiring people based on whether they fit a certain identity category. And so that, I was shocked at that, and I was shocked at the way in which our teaching of literature, even our choice of what literature to teach, our choice of what kind of sort of overarching narrative we were to use in the classroom, all of that was so heavily politicized, and it was evident that it really wasn't about being interested in literature and the various kinds of universal human truths that it enables us to understand. It was really about conveying a certain sort of story about injustice and about the better world that we were all supposed to be agreed we were working together to create. And that's been going on, I think, in universities, certainly across North America and elsewhere in the English-speaking world. That's been going on now probably for about 30 years. And it's meant that certainly the study of English literature is nothing what it once was and what many people probably think it's about. It's about, thinking the right thoughts and making every literary text that you read in some way illuminate those right thoughts, either because the text fails to fulfill our 21st century ideals about what it should say, what its values should be, or because it expresses those correct ideological values. And it just seems to me a really impoverished, really limited way of approaching the study of literature, but that's going on all across North America and elsewhere, and it's going on in many humanities disciplines, not just English, but I think English is probably one of the worst hit, and it's deeply embedded in most of the social sciences as well, and it's even invading the hard sciences now, as far as I can tell from the little I understand of what goes on in those disciplines. So it's a real shame, because it means that students who come to university, we all have this idea that university is about opening people's minds, that it's about, pursuing truth and understanding a subject from a whole variety of perspectives. It means that students are actually being robbed of that opportunity, and they're coming out often at the end of their university career with a much more narrow and limited view of the world, a dogmatic and prescriptive view of the world. That is really unfortunate and actually incredibly damaging for them and for the wider society.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how much it has gone through. As you mentioned, like hard sciences, there was a report that came out, I think it was last year, about Gender and Glaciers, which was a collaboration between...
Yes.
Yeah.
I saw that. It could be a satire, except that it isn't, right? It just seems almost unbelievably silly that gender concerns are even invading that kind of serious research. And yet I've had friends of mine have sent me articles similarly, so focused on gender. And I've read articles about how it's very important to have people of color and women, in, for instance, astrophysics, because it's going to improve the discipline to have diversity. And, this notion that diversity of perspectives, but always based, of course, on these rigid identity categories, that these are now necessary as a way to make astrophysics or whatever it happens to be more just, it's a straitjacket that is bound to harm the disciplines.
Well, also harm the budget. I mean, the Genuine Glaciers, that was given $400,000 for research budget from the U.S. federal government. I think it was ridiculous. But with the diversity of opinions, they had the case in South Africa where they had students saying that science was a very European construct and needed to be scrapped and built again to accommodate, the views of Africans and women. And it's but the average person, I don't think, knows about this. Because, obviously academia is the magical land where everything can happen, but it happens in academia. Somebody on a construction site or in an office or whatever, generally doesn't get exposed to this.
Yeah. No, I think most people still think that academia is about pursuing truth and it's about objective knowledge. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case for a long time. And I'm actually really feeling very negative about the academic enterprise. I don't know that it can now really be saved. That I know sounds probably catastrophizing, but I really think that it has become so deeply corrupted by these ideas about gender ideology and social justice, by the infiltration of cultural Marxism. I can't imagine that it could be reformed without some kind of general collapse and a rebuilding of the whole idea of the university pretty much from the ground up. I would actually be in favor of, I think we need to pass some kind of policy that ideology is just going to have to be kept out of the university altogether, and the teaching of humanities and social sciences would have to just entirely change, because what's going on now is very, very wasteful and really counterproductive. And it's making the university a place where many people who have conservative views, for instance, people who many men, who don't buy into feminist ideology, it's making the university a place where those people feel distinctly unwelcome. And in fact, we are seeing, I'm not sure if this is going on in New Zealand as well, it's certainly going on in North America, that men are just dropping out of university altogether because it's such a hostile place for them. And that's obviously going to have massive negative impacts on society overall if men aren't pursuing higher education.
Yes, I remember reading a few years ago, I can't remember who the author was, but it was a book called Political Correctness, the Ideological Struggle. And in it, he was saying how the English departments at universities were the last strongholds of communism. They were basically talking about how political correctness is used to shape people's thinking, like it was in the Soviet Union. He cited a Polish play where the writer was looking at this, constantly changing language, and the main character's conclusion was that truth was the enemy of the state. So yes, sometimes when you sort of put objective truth to some of these people, they really, really just don't like it.
Yeah, they don't believe there is such a thing. The idea that truth is always really just an expression of power, that the people who are in power are those who define what truth is. That has been an idea. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the essential idea of postmodernism, and that has been the reigning orthodoxy in English departments and other humanities disciplines for many decades. That's widely accepted now. And, and the idea that learning about literature is really about learning about power and how power is exercised by elite white men who dominate and subjugate everyone else, and how what we really should be doing in our disciplines is figuring out how to resist that kind of power and how to create a utopian society of equality and justice for all, in a very, very particular manner, involving environmental justice, involving gender justice, involving racial justice, involving the redistribution of wealth, involving, equality of outcome, all those kinds of things. Those are accepted now as part of the mandate of an English department, not simply to learn about, the history of the great works of literature in English. It's a pretty terrifying picture of ideological conformity.
Yes, and it's always conformity, isn't it? They talk about diversity, but it's never the department is all liberals. We need to hire a conservative, is it?
No. Yeah, that the intellectual diversity is the last thing that anybody is interested in an English department. And and that is the reason that I feel that I can't imagine how they could be reformed, because those who are on the left, liberal, or progressive side of the political spectrum are pretty unapologetic about making sure that others are kept out. They do talk about diversity, but of course they don't mean, conservative or libertarian people being invited in, or people who are Orthodox Christians, or there's a whole variety of supporters of Israel, whatever it happens to be, a whole variety of forbidden views that nobody's interested in including in the mix, although inclusion is another buzzword that is very, very popular. And I've sat in meetings of the graduate committee in which we evaluated applications for our master's and PhD programs, and in which my colleagues were quite open about excluding people whose views were considered, retrograde or hateful or whatever it happened to be. And that might be somebody who wanted to pursue a study from a Catholic theological perspective, they have no shame in exercising their power to make sure that people who are hired and graduate students who are admitted into the program are those who think in the correct ways. Whereas conservatives are probably potentially like this as well. Maybe conservatives are more right now the proponents of free expression and true diversity, because we know we couldn't possibly enforce an orthodoxy on our own. But I think conservatives and libertarian types and true liberals, at least in some way, theoretically believe in the idea of free debate and of people arguing about things in order to come to a better understanding. Whereas I don't think people on the hard left have ever tended to believe that, and they certainly don't now.
Yes, because it's not strictly a left or right thing, is it? Because there are classical liberals. I mean, there are very few in the ground these days, but who believe in free speech, etc. But it's more the progressives that have gone in for cultural Marxism, which is censorship, and you can't say this, you can't say that. And that seems to be the central tenet which everything else flows from. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, we'll just have this little bit of censorship. Well, you just can't say that. But, you know, so much flows from the issue of freedom of speech.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't have, the right to say, I disagree, and to follow that through without terrible consequences that affect your career, then it is no longer in any way a liberal culture of individualism and freedom. And that is what we're at now. We've just had a huge debate here in Canada, especially at the University of Toronto. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the newest... Dr. Peterson?
Yep. Well, I know, but the listeners probably wouldn't.
Yeah, well, that's the newest sort of vanguard of politically correct speech, has to do with gender pronouns, and we now have, I forget how many official potential pronouns for people who don't identify as either male or female. So there's been the creation of a whole bunch of other sorts of pronouns, including they, plural pronoun to refer to someone who doesn't identify within the gender binary, but other types as well, new invented pronouns, she, he, and je, and various other types of words. And we've just recently had a bill introduced at the federal level. It already does exist at the provincial level, making gender identity and gender expression part of the Human Rights Code and part of the prohibited grounds of discrimination, so that if somebody wants to be referred to by one of these new pronouns and they encounter somebody who isn't comfortable calling someone je, or calling a single individual they, or whatever it happens to be, that person can actually be convicted of discrimination under the Human Rights Code. And the professor at the University of Toronto has been raising this as a fundamental issue of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. And he's making the point that it's one thing to say that you can't say certain things, to say that there's certain words that you can't use, or certain expressions, certain opinions that you can't express because they're hateful or discriminatory. I mean, that is a problem in itself, most of us believe, but it's one kind of problem. It's another kind of problem to start forcing people, on pain of being hauled before a human rights tribunal, to say certain things that they might perhaps deeply believe are untrue. So we're now into that new realm where people are going to actually be forced under pain of investigation and potentially being fined, to use made-up pronouns that people might demand they use. So, yeah, there's all sorts of frontiers where the insistence on correct speech is being pursued, and there always will be new areas of the forbidden or the necessary, and where it'll end, nobody knows.
Yes, very much the thing that disturbs me is, they will force you, and they will fine you, and they will, give you a bad name and affect your employment, and if you don't agree with them. I mean, how is that not, fascism, pretty much?
Yeah, well, but it somehow, it's amazing to me the number of people who go along. Our Canadian government right now is developing legislation to curb what it sees as a widespread problem of Islamophobia, and so it's thinking about bringing in essentially versions of blasphemy laws that will make criticism of Islam be a violation of the Human Rights Code as well. My president of the University of Ottawa is a former head of the Quebec Human Rights Commission, and he was very much in favor of legislation to outlaw criticism of Islam. And, these are extremely bright people, very well educated, very knowledgeable. I'm sure he could argue with me, very persuasively about why this is necessary and good, and why it isn't really, an unjust infringement of one's freedoms. But it's, to me, it seems pretty obviously quite outrageous. And when he was head of the Quebec Human Rights Commission, they were talking about fines of up to $200,000 for if it was a repeat offense, someone criticizing Islam and saying bad things about that ideology. That's a pretty good way to shut people up. Most people can't absorb a $200,000 fine or even a $10,000 fine. And yet, our various human rights tribunals regularly fine people in the amounts of $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 simply for offending someone or in some minor way discriminating against somebody.
I was just thinking if they were enforced in New Zealand, the show would probably owe millions. But
yeah.
Well, we've got a few minutes left.
Well, I hope it doesn't come to New Zealand. It's insidious, and what's amazing to me, why I started to say that about the federal government of Canada bringing in these Islamophobia, this Islamophobia legislation, is that it's been almost not talked about at all. There's no real interest and no protest at all, really, to speak of. You would think people would be up in arms, but it's amazing how a population can become, very passive about these sorts of things and just accept these limitations as somehow in the common good.
Because wasn't there a shooter that attacked the Canadian Parliament who was a Muslim attack?
Yeah. There was a young man who went into the Canadian Parliament, and that was 2 years ago in October. He killed a soldier at our cenotaph in Ottawa, and then he sprinted up the street and went right into the House of Commons. All of our politicians, members of the House of Commons, were hiding out in closets and little rooms for the entire day, even after he'd been killed, while they made sure that there were no other shooters on the loose. I think they're still not quite sure whether he had an accomplice who got away or not, and he was eventually killed. But yeah, this is now the norm in Western countries. He was someone who wanted to join ISIS and was frustrated that he wasn't able to. And often, when these things happen, that's when then the discourse becomes about how we have to be very careful. We have to be more careful from now on what we say about Islam so that we don't trigger people. We don't trigger this kind of violence. And the implication often is that those who are critical of Islam are actually inviting the violence against them, and that pushing, a kind of hardline, absolutist free speech position is no longer acceptable. That we will simply have to accept aspects of Sharia law, including not saying certain things about Islam.
Well, I was talking with somebody who is Danish, and the Danish government are going to be paying welfare benefits to returning Danish Islamic State fighters who are returning. He said, if you try to speak out, people, you just get attacked as Islamophobic. Mm-hmm. And it's like, But, yep, we've got 40 seconds left. Where can people find you?
Well, I have my own little video series called the Fiamengo File. And so if anybody puts that into Google, that will come up, and that's sort of my main contribution to cultural discussion right now about a range of subjects, mainly about feminism, criticizing feminist ideology, especially at the university.
And you can find that on Studio Brule. Thank you very much.
Brule, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janice.
Well, thank you for having me on.